They follow for 2 years to recover nutrients. This was used for grazing livestock, which added manure. It was then returned to use and tile, while in turn another third, which had been used for raising crops, was left to lie fallow. There was thus a regular crop rotation to save exhausting the soil. In the earliest times, plowing was done with a simple device called an ard or scratch plow. Where the soil was stony working, it was very hard. The tiller had to keep watching the plow and used great force to push it into the ground. Similarly, clumsy and imperfect were the harrows at the time. After harrowing, any remaining clods of earth would be crumbled with a mattock or wooden mallet. This work was typically done by women and children. The most common crop, wheat, used to be full of weeds and as such, and not every economical. 15 largish sheaves yielding only about 18 kilograms of grain, often even less. Harvesting often had to be done using only a sickle for cutting. After drying, the grain was threshed out. Vegetables and legumes were cultivated to a greater extent than today, grown in fenced gardens next to houses. These were mostly peas and lentils, but also vetch and beans. And around the villages, flax and hemp were grown extensively. Hops were grown in seigneurial fields for the liege lord's brewery. Foreigners. Since ancient times, the foreigner meant not only anyone who came from outside one's town or village and was thus a potential enemy, but also any person without legal status. Foreigners were without legal rights until they paid a surety. This matter was handled by courts of law, and there were various regulations setting fees for running a business or renting a house. Foreigners were not allowed to acquire but inherit ownership of them. The Bohemia lands were long open to foreigners, relatively speaking, with lively trade and cultural exchanges. First were the Celts, then Germanic tribes, and later the Slavs, but a large portion of the populace consisted of German-speaking people. The Germans were mainly courtiers or worked entrepreneurs and merchants. Relations with the Germans were neutral at first, cooling off later, and ending up with animosity against all things German, though that was still far removed from the strident nationalism of the 19th century. Worse relations existed between the Czechs and Germans on one side and the Jews on the other. They lived outside of society, which, often having got permission from the king for a handsome price, carried out programs against them. Plague and disease in the mid-14th century affected migration. The few foreigners came to Bohemia. During the Hussite Wars, most of the towns had a majority Czech citizenry. Only the main centers in Moravia remained largely German. Brno, Jihlava, Iglau, and Olmut. The Czech language gradually permeated from rural society to the higher social strata. A fundamental change in how language and ethnicity was viewed came with the Hussite Wars, in which most Czech speakers identified with the Hussites, while most Germans supported Sigismund and Pope. This was exacerbated by the foreign, often German crusade summoned by Sigismund against the upstart Hussites. Furniture. At the beginning of the 15th century, Czech furniture was made of planks and boards, using construction of varying intricacy. Timber used was oak, fir, walnut, linden, ash, larch, or spruce. The surface was treated with beeswax or linseed varnish. By the end of Gothic period, shellac varnish came into use. Staining was done by smoking using fermented cabbage water or blanching with lime water. Tables and chairs had much the same design, with flat side panels or X-shaped boards. Chests were made in various sizes for keeping dry goods, garments, or other small items of property. Townspeople slept on beds with drapes Village homes were very simply furnished. The peasants made their own furniture from split and dressed planks and posts. In peasant cottages, they slept on beds of hay or straw laid on the ground. Joiners and carvers decorated furniture with ornamentation. The most expensive furniture had metal elements which served to brace and reinforce as well as having decorative function. Most of the furniture in key CD is based on medieval examples from the 12th–16th centuries. Greetings. The basic form of greeting was bowing, with numerous variations depending on the occasion and the mutual status of participants. A light bow with the hand on the heart would befit two noblemen of equal rank. A deeper bow was a more respectful greeting to a guest or someone of higher standing. The next level was to kneel on the left knee and bow the head in deference to rulers, barons, and high-ranking commanders, and it expressed allegiance. The person would have to remain in this position until invited by the superior to rise. The most subordinate level was to bow while down on both knees, an expression of complete subjugation often combined with a plea typically for mercy. Doffing headwear was a practice that came in with Burgundian fashion in the 15th century. Loyalty was expressed by kissing the rings of magnates and prelates. It was not proper to kiss the hands of ladies, but they were given a deeper bow than their social rank alone would elicit. Particular forms of salutation also applied when addressing a certain person, for example, in writing. For example, a townsman was to be addressed as Honest or Baronet as esteemed, and a titular lord as highborn. In the countryside, people greeted each other according to their nature, often mentioning in the greeting wishes of good health, prosperity, and God's blessing, or making reference to Christian tradition, God bless, Christ be praised, etc. Guilds and crafts. Medieval town society was made up largely of craftsmen and merchants who ensured its socio-economic growth. Based on their freeman rights, they could exercise their craft and had the right to market. In addition to privileges such as the protection of and support of the town's operation, health care, and food provision, it was their duty to pay taxes on every sale or transport of goods outside the town limits. In essence, the status of the municipality was dependent on them, hence it was important that they did not relocate and ply their trade elsewhere, passing their occupation on to following generations. In the space of 1 century, several craftsmen of the same profession would be active in a town. These artisans gradually began to form themselves into groups with political and economic rules or members' guilds. They had their seals of office and pennants bearing the guild crests granted by the monarch. Each member of the guild had the support of the others, and they all agreed on prices and the regulation of sales and the rules of apprenticeship and discharging their duties. No one without guild membership could trade in goods. Heraldry is the doctrine of characters and symbols depicted on coats of arms governed by fixed rules, and the relevant know-how was privy to nobles and knights. It was necessity because Europe of that time had so many noble families, they simply could not be memorized by applying heraldic symbolism and rules. However, the wearer and his dynasty could be identified from his battle pennants and coat of arms. Simplified heraldic symbolism was also used on the arms and equipment of urban militias and the attire of soldiers of feudal lords. Houses and dwellings. The core of the medieval house, whether in a village or town, consisted of a kitchen, a hall, and living room, a hearth-room. All were on the ground floor. From the 15th century onwards, upper stories started to be added. The walls were insulated from the outside with clay daub, which also gave the house some fire protection. Windows were kept very small to save heat. The grounds of the house were usually fenced in, and the courtyard had gates broad enough to admit a covered wagon. Attached to houses were utility buildings, barn stables, outhouses, forges, and woodsheds or food granaries. Waste was taken outside the house into the fields or disposed of in cesspits. Outside the house would be toilets built over sewage pits. A typical village house was a single story with a front door leading in from the courtyard into a central space, of which was a living room and chamber. The houses were built of wood and stone foundations. The jizba, or main room for village households, constituted the living space and kitchen with an oven and a hearth. Above the hearth was a smoke hole to the roof space. Other areas served as stores for cereals, tools, food in jars or chests, etc. Lighting was provided by torches, candles, in pottery candlesticks, and most of all by firelights from the hearth. The floor was compacted clay mixed with straw, leaves, or animal hair. The roof was typically thatched. Sheaves of rye or reed straw often doubled. In front of the house was a garden and a courtyard with farm buildings for poultry, pigs, and cattle. Invective. Although the more educated or higher born tried to keep invective and vulgarities out of their speech, swearing has been part of the vernacular since time immemorial. Profanity was not only verbal, but often appeared in written form in documents and sought to defame and humiliate those addressed. Some of the slurs arose by corrupting foreign language expressions. Others were derived from animals and their attributes, often used as insults, were onomatopoeic words, articulated noises, or metaphors. Words derived from adjectives, attitudes towards work, criminal offenses, political stances, professions, psychological malice, or people's names. The worst kind of insult questions the honor of the individual, such as swear words quite often led to court cases or duels. It was common practice that anyone not prepared to defend their honor would indeed lose it in the eyes of those around. Jews. The Jews settled in Moravia and Bohemia probably even earlier than the 10th century. Initially, they were considered foreigners who the Romans had banished into exile. Jewish traders in the Chessland settled largely around the long-distance trade routes in major centers, which in early Middle Ages were Olomouc, Brno, Znojmo, and the central Elbe River environs. Most lived in Prague. However, records tell of about 120 houses in the market Jewish quarter of the old town. They were under the legal protection of decrees by Wenceslas II and subsequently Charles IV. Over the centuries, however, the flourishing of their activities as merchants and financiers gave rise to protests from many elements of society, in particular the Catholic Church. The Jews had indeed improved valuable gold and used it to barter for horses, furs, and slaves. Their rights became progressively circumscribed. They could not buy land or houses, had to live in specially designed ghettos, were allowed to lend money at interest, usury, and to trade only where they were not in competition with the locals, and were prohibited from working as craftsmen or farmers. The segregation of Jews was also underlined by enforced labeling. They had to wear, for example, a yellow circle or yellow ribbon on their garments, or a specifically shaped hat. The women had to have a yellow ribbon in their hair, and the men mandatory beards. No help came from the church, which traditionally laid the blame on them for being the killers of Christ and for adhering to pagan rituals. In the Middle Ages, the Jews were considered the king's own and under his protection, so that if the townspeople were inclined to commit a pogrom, to set fire to the quarter and massacre the inhabitants, they would have to pay the king hefty reparations. Some kings looked forward to such pogroms as a good source of income. Others protected the Jews. For example, Wenceslas IV granted the Prague Jews right to their own town within Prague, with its own wall and 6 gates, but even this failed to protect them from the pogrom in 1389 when the king was traveling abroad. After his return, he levied the ultimate punishment of the organizers of the pogrom, which quelled further attacks for some time, though they made comeback with the Hussite movement. Land army. The territorial army or provincial militia drew on the nobles, princes, lords, squires, with their retinues, the garrisons of clerical dignitaries, bishops, and from 1344 on even the archbishop, the militias of royal towns, villages, bailiffs, and custodians. It served to defend the land and was called up as needed by the monarch. Municipal finances. Towns and cities always had to look after the budgets, so they collected taxes, customs, duties, tolls, and unjust goods tariffs. The most common form of tax was paid twice a year in amount dependent on the assets of each respective citizen. Another source of civic revenue money were monies made by the city council or the city court for the making of contracts, documents, records, and other ongoing activities. Fees and taxes were paid by the city residents based on their business, levied on products sold or services provided. The treasury also collected money for interest payments, fines, building funds, loans, and various forms of letting and rental to serfs. Written records were maintained for all revenues. The city council paid out some of the money for the purchase of real estate, paid the nobility for the defense and security, invested in schools, civic cultural development, churches administration, and the salaries of city officials, construction, operation and maintenance, and the upkeep of municipal buildings. Names and surnames. The period of the 13th century was characterized by Slavonic names, mostly of pagan origin. Common people would keep names short and simple, like Odolen, the robust, Dobrosh, the good, Shval, the praised. Names were also given according to place in society. Compound names such as Drahomira, who values peace, Boleslav, more famed, more fabled, and Ludmila, dear to the people, were reserved for royalty and the nobility. Christian names were derived from Latin: Paul, Sylvester, Florian, Hebrew, James, Daniel, John, and Greek: Andrew, Nicholas, Peter. Once Christianity took over completely, only names belonging to Christian martyrs were permitted in the towns and the countryside. The prevailing names were John, Peter, Margaret, Catherine, and Anna, while the nobility retained the privilege of using names like Sophia, Elizabeth, Jacob, Ulrich, and Hermann. Additional by-names added information about the location of the family seat, social or religious standing, or about relationships with the relatives. For example, Divish, Z, Tal, Berka, Inki, CD, Divish of Talberg, and so on. In addition, sometimes an epithet would be used. For example, Jan Zaich, Hanekin Heir of Waldeck, John the Younger of Hradec, etc. The growing population and the limited number of the first names gave rise to the surname as we know it today. The surname was derived from the place where the person lived, like in English, for example, hill, woods, forest, from their occupation, coachman, miller, smith, from their physiognomy or appearance, rude, small, brown, or were patronymics derived from the father's forename, Davis, Little, John, or matronymics derived from the mother's forename, Marriott, Beaton. Pennants and banners. In the heat of medieval battle, where most of the combatants had the same or similar equipment, the pennant or banner was often the only sign differentiating friend from foe. Pennants also helped lift morale and to organize the various units during troop movements around 14th century. I mean, around 14th. Around year 1400, pennants and banners took the shape of extended triangles, upright rectangles, and squares. Flags were fashioned from colored canvas or silk, and depictions or emblems were painted into them, most often the coats of arms of the respective feudal lords. Cavalry carried small pennants on their spears, and craftsmen who were members of the guilds also had their own banners. The guild banners was emblematic of the profession and was shown at public ceremonies and at military and other ostentatious events. The banner of Chesslands dates back to the 13th century and depicts ghouls, a lion rampant, Kui for Chi Argent, a two-tailed silver lion raised on its hind legs on a red background. Safe conduct. The safe conduct document was issued by a member of the highest social tier to guarantee the bearer's safety. Most often it gave protection in a particular territory during a journey, and sometimes the bearer was also provided with an armed escort. For example, Jan, who was